I never expected to get so invested in an espionage RPG. I don't like stealth games. I like a certain patience for them. But I love Obsidian's work. I love role-playing games, and I've always been curious about their journey as a studio. Alpha Protocol was Obsidian's first original idea, pitched to Sega, and given all the time and money necessary to succeed. Or so they thought. The studio was too acclimated to being rushed, and when presented with reasonable budgets and deadlines, they failed to spend it wisely. The game's development was plagued with problems, the greatest being a lack of direction. They were making an espionage RPG, but that's as deep as the pitch went. It was genius, but directionless. Until very late in the project, when Chris Parker and Chris Avallone brought that direction. Only near the tail end of the development's lifespan did they scramble to tie the knot on the sprawling title. In the end, it received divided reviews. There was some positive feedback admiring the title and team's efforts, but overall, it performed well under expectations. Despite that, hindsight has shown us that Alpha Protocol pioneered many ideas that would later be refined and serves as a prototype that inspired future Western RPGs, and taught the studio many important lessons. Even today, it holds up with novelty and eccentricity, the potential rumbling below its surface threatening to erupt. But to this day, it never did. And there's been no calls for refinement, no successor, spiritual or otherwise. It's a shame that Sega has let it fall by the wayside, allowing its music licenses to expire, and the game to be delisted on digital platforms. The main reason I looked into Alpha Protocol at all was because it was Obsidian's RPG. It's what they do best. I always expect a level of quality to their role-playing experiences, especially when fielding the controversial but talented Avallone. However, with Alpha Protocol, it's always a mixed bag. Looking back, it's much simpler than I expected, but in the moment it was captivating. Especially because the dialogue system implemented was revolutionary, and I think would be parried later by Deus Ex's Mankind Divided. The real-time dialogue system got rid of conversational loops, added real tension to the scenes, and made all the interactions feel more immersive. The greatest achievement of AP is with its tight, small, but potent cast. Every character feels layered by their allegiances, personality, and role in the greater geopolitical world. Not everyone's a spy, and not everyone acts like one. There's plenty of mercenaries, politicians, terrorists, and innocents, and all can be treated however the player wishes. It was shocking when early on you could align yourself with a terrorist, given the genre's space and the time of its creation. There are plenty of similar snippets where the writers diverge from the classic B-action movie tropes and opt for something interesting, or even something weird. I enjoyed the protagonist interactions with each of the characters, choosing who I disliked, who I respected, who I feared, and who I'd like watching my back. It's easy to pick sides, but never in a moral sense. Avallone and Obsidian alike seem to hate the moral meters of Western RPGs like Fable and BioWare, and it reflects in the ambiguity of the player's choices. Alpha Protocol isn't afraid to punish the player for being the hero. It's refreshing. Plus, this means the player is never locked out of choice because their moral meter isn't high enough. Instead, the good can turn bad on a dime. There's complete autonomy in the player's choices. And choice is powerful because of consequence. It's a core philosophy of Obsidian and its old writer. The smallest decisions can have major changes, akin to Witcher 2's widely branching narrative. And while not as insane as being practically 2 games in one, and never mentioning it, Alpha Protocol is still impressive with its reactivity and replayability. There's an alternate boss fight hidden away. Dialogue changes wildly based on both decisions and relationship meters. And a developer has said that a player may only see as much as a third of the game's cutscenes in a single playthrough. Alpha Protocol is short, but it makes up for that by being extremely rich with replayability. The player can by default play as 3 distinct types of Thornton, our protagonist. The suave Thornton emulates Bond, the professional imitates Bourne, and the aggressive is Brower. The option to choose whatever is always present, but there's room for at least 3 playthroughs worth of personality due to the malleable and diverse amount of character Thornton holds. Not to mention the variety of independent choices. No one personality is for or against who you save or kill, and there's a lot of crucial NPCs free to execute. It's quite brutal. Finally, it's reinforced by all the seemingly secret and hidden pieces of content. There are bosses, cutscenes, and details crucial to the broader plot, locked behind specific outcomes and interactions. Which brings up the idea of a broader plot. I admit, scouring the details, secrets, and overall world of Alpha Protocol is much more fun and interesting than a story. I enjoy the immersive moments and lore of the world so much more than its lackluster plot. And it's not terrible, more so, it's forgettable, even in the middle of itself. It essentially boils down to the government selling and ignoring black site operations to companies for mutual benefit, and the whole of Alpha Protocol is using Thornton as a scapegoat. It's almost interesting, but everything between the first act and the finale feels absent from the plot. The characters are all much more interesting, and their place in the story is what keeps it engaging, despite some abrupt telling towards the end. And overall, I just think I expected more. Still, there are some interesting bits present, like the interrogations between chapters, flashing forward into the future before the final level. It reminds me of a less polished Persona 5 interrogation sequence, and I'd like to wonder if they got the idea from Obsidian. Like I mentioned before, there's a powerful sequence where Thornton is punished for being the hero, and forced no matter what to sacrifice something. It was an excellent subversion. Plus, the payoff of its conclusion is incredible. I wish every game just let me satisfyingly punch a bullet through the antagonist's brains. Alpha Protocol is an espionage RPG. In essence, it's a third-person shooter in a modern-day setting, much like Mass Effect, but nowadays. It's trying to capitalize on the one-man army trope in a complex and somewhat morally ambiguous geopolitical climate, where the player has any and every means as well as motivation to achieve a simple goal: vengeance, or the truth. There are several methods to the player's ultimate goal that can and will shape the world. Going loud with guns blazing, or with a more discreet approach, will have consequences. I prefer going loud, and even with Alpha Protocol's admittedly quick stealth system, I lacked the patience to commit to it. I'd start the mission as quietly as possible, but once the guard heard the rustling of body armor and gear, it was only a matter of time before gunfire alerted the entire level. Alpha Protocol isn't necessarily a hard game, and I was able to brute force it accordingly, though I admit that it's partly because the AI in-game isn't the smartest. Regardless, it took some adjustment to master the aiming mechanic, essentially built to incentivize stealth. The reticle will not focus or narrow your stream of bullets unless you stand perfectly still, and aim perfectly still. The way around the system was a hail of bullets, which once or twice resulted in mid-level ammo issues, but otherwise wasn't too toxic to the play. It offered opportunities for mechanical creativity, like quick-firing my pistol to break enemies' guards melee. And despite being an RPG shooter, it managed to avoid my main complaint against the genre, of annoying bullet sponges or guns that don't feel right due to awkward numerics. Instead, shotguns felt like shotguns, rifles like so, and pistols were fairly potent. My only real complaint is that the cover system doesn't feel polished whatsoever, having issues with positioning physics and the illusion of safety cover sometimes provided. It felt severely underdeveloped and was a real sore spot. Overall, the action was competent, minus some minor issues. In comparison with something like Mass Effect, it manages to be a more active shooter. The ability is more akin to Mass Effect 2 over ME1's, being active components of the play that have genuine impact, and the addition of items, as well as the one-man army mantra, managed to make it feel distinct and entertaining. On the other hand, stealth wasn't my go-to. I did research on others' playthroughs, and the takeaway is that stealth isn't consistent. Finicky cover AI in the game overall leaves room for bugs. Whether it be the AI seeing you through walls or treating the player like they're invisible, there's no definite rules. I can clearly tell the studio has little practice with this genre, whereas with the action and shooter elements, I can see some inexperience, but still felt that they did overall well with it. There's not enough thought presented to the levels, the sightlines, the detection systems, and when directly compared to Metal Gear or Splinter Cell, I see a lack of options and systems present to make the play interesting or engaging. There's nothing like Pandora Tomorrow's experience of tracking enemies, memorizing paths, whistling foes away from well-lit areas, or abusing a vast variety of lethal and non-lethal tools to tackle any and every situation. I have no patience for stealth games, and the few I have played appeared to be the pinnacle of their genre. Suffice to say, I didn't find stealth at all enticing in Alpha Protocol. The RPG systems present were also unconventional, but surprisingly a welcome addition. Customizing my loadout was a highlight of the game, and while it's far from Tarkov's gun porn, it still manages to scrape that same feeling. I had to juggle resources to invest in gear, or save it all away to buy bigger and better guns. Every minor achievement or even choice I made resulted in a perk that provided gameplay benefits. It translated my experiences into game progression. It managed to incorporate several interesting, albeit simple RPG systems without ever compromising its shooter side to a numbers game. I wasn't dumping my entire stockpile into enemies, save some bosses, but it was done sparingly and intentionally enough to never be frustrating. It's one of Alpha Protocol's highlights. They managed to incorporate several clean RPG systems into a shooter and never overload or overbulk the play, which is damn impressive considering modern RPG shooters still struggle with the numeric bloat. It's far from perfect, but perfectly enjoyable as an espionage action RPG. And at its end, I have no idea how to feel about it. The game's nothing but outstanding. It's far from perfect, but there's still plenty of unique ideas at play here. Plus, more than any emotion, it just feels like Obsidian, especially the early Obsidian I know best. They manage, as they always have, to make a deeply flawed title interesting, fascinating even. The reactivity of the world and choices is impressive even today. There's a breadth of options and flexibility even in the play, and it manages to fill a particular unsatisfied niche in the medium. I don't think there's a lack of market for espionage RPGs, especially because the closest alternatives tend to be licensed stealth games, or classics like Metal Gear and the aforementioned Splinter Cell. No other game lets the player be Bond, Brower, or Bourne, especially not one of their own making, and definitely without the complex branching narrative featured in Alpha Protocol. I think that Alpha Protocol has plenty of potential to be done again, spiritually or at the whims of Sega, by a seasoned team with a complete vision to replicate and polish the existing structure of this espionage RPG. Mostly because what's captivating about the title is still impressive today, over a decade later, and the void it filled has opened again. I think B-action movies still hold the same attraction today. Titanfall 2's campaign is a modern cult classic, with similar pulpy writing. It has room to jump on the RPG resurgence and cement itself once again with its still iconic pitch. If there's an Alpha Protocol 2 in the works, I hope it's coming soon, or at least happens at all.